Hello guys, and this video I'm gonna talk about the slave traders and the slaves. It's come from the Mankind in Amnesia from Velikovsky, and it's quite interesting because it touched the topic of slavery and all this topic of like reparations, white, black slave men and whatnot, and obviously proof in certain 2 or 3 pages. The quotes is kind of, I'm gonna read a bit of maybe 2 pages because I think it's essential to read all because it is very valuable in what it says, and also the preconception of people of slavery and stuff, and like obviously no one knows, well, not many people know very well that usually the biggest slave traders in the Asian world were the Arabs, okay, the Muslims, and they, some till some extent, they still have slaves today. So when people bring this white black slavery narrative, they need to understand that the biggest slave traders in the whole world were the Arabs. Okay, and then the English, the Portuguese, the French, and the rest, they come to the Arabs to buy their slaves. Okay, but anyway, let's read this few pages because it obviously reflect as well kind of this Stockholm syndrome and this master slave relationship. Okay, let's quote and let's don't lose more time. I don't know if I'm gonna have time to do it in this slot that I have. So we start. The continent of Africa is divided into what is called the Black Continent and the Northern Fringe, north of Sahara, occupied by the Berber or Arab states. The east coast of Africa runs parallel to the west coast of Arabia, and on the Indian Ocean coast, Zanzibar, the old station of Arab slave traders, completes a wide arc. The Arabs preyed on the African blacks and sold them into slavery wherever there was a demand. Slavery was also imposed on war prisoners of other races, and Columbus made slaves out of his carried prisoners. But it was especially in modern times the continent of Africa that served as the hunting ground for slaves. From the beginning of the 16th century, the importation of slaves into the Western Hemisphere was uninterrupted until only a few generations ago. Though limited by legislation in the States about 1800, the trade went on until the end of the Civil War and continued in neighboring countries in 1873. Only a little over 4 generations ago, of the 1.5 million population of Cuba, 500,000 of a third of the population were slaves. Under the heading Mohammedan Slavery, the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica narrates, and though encyclopedias are not the sources I like to quote, I make an exception in this case. This is quoted from the Encyclopedia Britannica. The Central Sudan appeared to be one vast hunting ground. Captives were brought thence to the slave market of Kuka in Bornu, where after being bought by dealers they were to the number of about 10,000 annually, marched across the Sahara to Mursuk in Fezzan, from which places they were distributed to the northern and eastern Mediterranean coasts. Their suffering on the route were dreadful. Many succumbed and were abandoned. It is reported that anyone who did not know the way by which the caravan passed would only have to follow the bones which lie right and left on the track. Negroes were also brought to Morocco from the western Sudan and from Timbuktu. The center of the traffic in Morocco was Sidi Hamed ibn Musa, 7 days' journey south of Mogador, where a great yearly fair was held. The slaves were forwarded hence in groups to different towns, especially to Marrakesh, Fez, and Meknès, all Muslim countries. Let's carry on. The Sultan levied an ad valorem duty on the slave trade. From Morocco, French, Portuguese, British, and other ships carried the purchased slaves to their destinations. The Zanzibar Arabs on the eastern coast of Africa were the greatest traders of all. Black villages would be put to the torch when their population were asleep, sometimes with the connivance of the village chief, and the fleeing blacks would be captured, thus becoming human merchandise. Okay, we understand here that the chief of the tribe sometimes betray their own people. Okay, Many of those transported in chains on Arab ships, often not seaworthy, died of maltreatment, thirst, and exposure to the sun, and of some cargoes crossing the Atlantic, no more than 50 out of 100 survived the passage. Horrible, isn't it? The British, the French, the Portuguese, and others buying the slaves in Africa markets moved them to Europe, but mainly to the Americas. The British statistics had it that exclusive of the slaves who died before they sailed from Africa, 12.5% were lost during their passage to the West Indies. At Jamaica, 4.5% died while in the harbors or before the sail, and 1/3 more in the seasoning. The Zanzibar traders could not claim an equally favorable survival of the human cargo. The slave trade to the Western Hemisphere continued after the Civil War, but diminishing. It looked for other outlets with further declines after the 1870s. The chief absorbing market became the Arab countries themselves, and especially the Arabian Peninsula. The delivery area being the northern, eastern, and eastern coast of the African continent. There was also an inner trade with the Black Kingdoms of Uganda, Benin, and Dahomey. The Arab traders being here, too, the suppliers. Many of the slaves were also sacrificed in pagan ceremonies. The 19th century explorers, Dr. David Livingstone, Sir Samuel Baker, and Dr. Henrik Bath described these practices. Black slaves were until quite recently bought and sold in Arabian markets, especially on the Arabian Peninsula. With the spread of the Mohammedan religion among the blacks of the eastern coast of Africa, the trader posed as missionaries, inviting the faithful to embark on pilgrimages to Mecca. On arrived, they were sold, never to return to Africa to tell the true story of their travels. In the littoral kingdoms, in the Emirates and Sultanates of the Arabian Peninsula, slavery was sanctified by tradition and protected by law. In violation of declarations of principles made by the European powers at various times, notably in the later part of the last century. These, notwithstanding, several member countries of the United Nations still practice slavery at home. This is written in the 60s. A characteristic social and psychological phenomenon is taking place in the process of the black reawakening in the United States. The 4th to 10th generation descendants of a slave, in the case of the West Indies only the 3rd generations, feel a resurgence of the longing for Africa that accompanied the fettered slaves on their forced voyage to this country and haunted the thoughts of the first generation of those working on plantations or in mines. But together with this black to Africa sentiment, a strange, even pathological phenomenon takes place. The most militant among the American blacks looks to the Arab as their allies and mentor, which is actually not true. Okay? The descendant of the slaves returned to those who preyed on them, took them captives, chained them, drove them mercilessly across deserts, let them die from thirst exhausted at oars on galleys. The urge to return to the tormentor or to his descendants to adopt their religions and to hail them as saviors is a reaction for which psychology knows the cause. A victim's children remain fascinated by the one who wielded a whip over their father. So, I think the quote, actually the few pages that I read are very, very good awakening call to all of those who are always with the white slave trade narrative, and also with the beauties of the religion of peace or the religion of the Middle East, and obviously it's called Islam. But I'm not exonerating other religions, absolutely not, because all the 3 major religions, the Abrahamic religions, and all, I would say, the truth of all evil. But maybe I get too far away in that. But if you ask me, getting deep into the roots of all those religions, they were all created by the same people, and they all have the same purposes with different kind of the different roads that lead to the same purpose. Okay, but anyway, very valuable information here. Also valuable for the context of psychological context, the psychological context of the trauma and the love for the person who caused the trauma, with people who kind of identify the problem and transpire and get above the trauma that they suffer, or even the phylogenetic trauma of their parents, as the case of the black slaves. Anyway, keep tuning in. I will come with more videos. Thank you so much.